Welcome to episode 86 of Anchored in Education. I'm E. Scott England, and Anchored in Education is the podcast dedicated to all things education. Educators across the world routinely engage in conversations surrounding fundamentals, concepts, and new ideas that improve this great profession. Sometimes we agree, other times we disagree. But at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education. Before I get started today, I want to offer a disclaimer. This episode contains explicit language. While this is uncharacteristic for Anchored in Education, it is within the context of today's topic. I completely understand if you prefer to skip today's episode, but just know that the content of today's episode is grounded in scientific research and is not intended to be offensive. Today we welcome back Jodie Eckleberry-Hunt. You might remember her from an episode back in October where we talked about her book, Move On, Motherfucker. When Jodie and I first started communicating about a podcast collaboration surrounding that book, she was coming out with another book. She offered to send me an advanced copy to review. The title of the new book was Getting to Good Riddance, a No-Bullshit Breakup Survival Guide. An odd book to cover for an education podcast. That is, until you fully grasp the meaning behind the podcast name. Everything is literally anchored in education. A lesson can be shaped out of anything. And so I reached out to Jodie and I said, hey, I'm reading Getting to Good Riddance and I can't help but think how I can apply this to leaving a bad boss or getting the hell out of Dodge when you're in an awful organization. I know because I had experienced both firsthand. Jodie chuckled and said, I actually wasn't the first to ask this question. So naturally I said, then if I'm not the only one thinking it, this must mean others need to hear it. Let's do another episode telling people how to break up with bad bosses, bad organizations, or bad habits. She agreed. Jodie, welcome back to Anchored in Education.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me back.
Oh, absolutely. It's going to be a fun conversation. Now, the last time you were here, we discussed your book, Move On, Motherfucker, and it was a hit. I mean, I had a lot of great feedback on that episode. And so we're getting back this time talking about your other book that came out afterwards called Getting to Good Riddance, a No-Bullshit Breakup Survival Guide. Now, at first glance, someone would believe this is solely about relationships between partners. But can't we apply the strategies you lay out in this book for really any situation, including, say, breaking up with a bad boss or a bad organization?
For sure. And in fact, I have gotten that feedback from several people who read it who weren't breaking up with a romantic relationship. And they pointed out that it, particularly with regard to work, that it was super helpful to look at breaking up with just the toxicity and yes, cultural issues. And some people have even said family or breaking up with alcohol, depending on the relationship. So I have been pleasantly surprised at how many people have reached out to me with that exact feedback.
Yeah. And did you kind of foresee that happening when you were writing this?
Quite honestly, I didn't. This book in particular, I wrote specifically because I have so many people coming into my practice who are heartbroken, and I could not find the right book for them to read. And it was like a tool that I wanted to have.
Yeah.
And I was a little surprised. Yeah. That
is like the ultimate problem solving. You want a book for them to read and you can't find, so you just write it.
Well, it was pent up for a while, so it just all came rushing out.
Well, I have loved reading it. Now, just to give an idea, the first couple of chapters gives the readers a quick refresher course in mindfulness, cognitive behavior therapy, and the science behind profanity and humor. And of course, MOMF was covered in like a chapter of its own. So you also talk briefly in the first chapter about the second arrow. And wow, did this cause some reflection on my part, because so many of us are guilty of this. Can you talk a little bit more about first what this is, why we do it, and then how can we avoid it?
Yeah. So it's a Buddhist story, and we just got out of fall here in the middle of the country. So I'm going to use this story. It's a beautiful day.
Yeah.
The leaves are colorful. The air is crisp, and you decide you're going to take a walk and just really take it all in. And you're walking through the woods, and you're struck by an arrow, like a hunter's arrow, and it's huge and it's sticking out of your body. That is the literal first arrow,
Yeah.
and it is a tragedy. The second one is the metaphorical, and it's what we all do in even in situations that are very tragic. And it's the arrow of suffering, where we say, "Oh my gosh, I should have never taken this walk.
All right.
I knew better. Bad things always happen to me. Why did I do this? In fact, who did this to me? This is terrible. Somebody needs to be punished. What if I can't go to work? What if I get an infection? What if my arm falls off? What if I lose my job?" And the metaphorical arrow is the second arrow that is under our control. And it's the one that makes a bad situation worse by judging and criticizing and, again, just pitying. And it doesn't mean that it's not a bad situation. It just means all of that negativity makes it worse. So we all do that. Why? I think it's just because how the mind is wired. And I think we're also programmed to look to see what can we fix, what can we do differently. But in fact, a lot of what happens in life is not foreseeable. It's not
Right.
under our control. And I think the mind is programmed to look for control. And we don't like the thought that we don't have control. And how do we stop it? It's just catching it while it's happening and saying, how is this helpful? And it's not. Like, would you say, I often say that, what would you say to a friend? A friend had gotten struck by an arrow. Would you say, gosh, I hope you don't lose your arm, or you're probably going to lose your job, or, you shouldn't have ever taken that walk.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't say it to a friend, don't say it to yourself.
Oh, that's really good advice. Now, we can probably expect, though, that even if we try to remove the second arrow from our metaphorical quiver, it's still going to be there. And so, you had said catch it in the act, catch it when it first happens. For someone that's not quite as adept to realizing that we're piercing ourselves over and over with this second arrow, what are some strategies you give people to first become aware that we're even doing this? Because some of us may not even realize how many times we stab ourselves with this arrow.
Well, I mean, you just asked me a huge question. That is the
Sorry about
basis of
that.
cognitive behavioral psychology and
Yeah.
mindfulness, what they now call a mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. It is the practice. First of all, it's understanding our own tendencies. If we're worriers, or if we're perfectionists, or what have you, that genetic or piece that is already wired in us. And then just practicing paying attention to the things that we say to ourselves in the moment, and coming back to breathing and working on letting go and detaching. Because again, there are bad things that happen in the world. COVID was bad.
Yes.
School shootings are bad. But it's saying that reminding ourselves, what can we control? And it's moving again from, yes, you were the victim of that, but how do you become a survivor? Like, at what point do you want to let what happened ruin your future?
And I love, that you say it takes practice, because, if I want to become a better piano player, I practice. If I want to become a better writer or speaker, I practice. And it only makes sense in what you're talking about, that to become better at recognizing and avoiding these sort of self-destructing things, that we have to practice at it. And I think so many times we're quick to give up, whenever really it's a matter of, practicing. Maybe if we pierce ourselves 5 times, next time we're only going to do it 4. That's an improvement.
100%. And it's interesting you say that. I remember this person who I taught cognitive behavioral theory and to one time and gave her a list of things to do. And she came back to see me 2 weeks later and she said, "Okay, I tried that. It's not working." And I kind of laughed, not making fun of her, but just sort of laughed out loud. And I said, "Well, you're confused. You won't know if it's working for about 6 months.
Oh, okay.
Every single day of practicing it. I get it. It's not, we all want a pill. We all want it
Oh,
to
yes.
be done. I get that, but it's incremental. And that actually goes to grief, which I know we're going to talk about too,
Yeah.
is people say, how do I get over this pain? And it's like one day at a time. Eventually you'll get there.
Yeah, and how right you are that we just want a quick fix, a quick, a pill, as you say, for everything, and that's not how things work. And so you've set us up for the perfect segue into to redirect ourselves back to getting to Good Riddance, chapter 4. You start talking about the stages of grief. This makes perfect sense when talking about a breakup, no matter what we're breaking up with or who we're breaking up with. But now, what I love about it, you put your own twist to them. In fact, to quote you, you momped them up. You momped them up, to be exact. I know firsthand the stages of grief are experienced when leaving an organization. Been there, done that. So can you spend some time talking about your proposed stages of grief?
Yeah, so I'll briefly hit on those. The first stage being denial, like this can't be happening. I think the brain always goes back to what can I do, what can I control, what part of this is me. But I the momped up stage is, excuse me, what the fuck just happened, or
Yeah.
what the hell is going on here? The next, and I hate that stage, by the way.
Yeah, you even said that in the book. That's the one you absolutely hate.
People spiral because again, you can get caught in that loop and you keep coming back to trying to figure it out when sometimes there's not going to be any kind of satisfactory answer. The next stage is my all-time favorite, anger.
Uh-huh.
And the momped up stage is, oh my God, you are such a motherfucker. So this is when you really get caught up in justified anger. And even if the other person's, not a motherfucker, it is just allowing yourself to feel that natural feeling of anger. The next stage, it's not one of my favorites, is the depression. The momped up stage is, oh shit, this hurts like hell. But you have to go through it. And that's the thing I try to convince people is you have to go through the pain. Martin Seligman is the father of positive psychology. And to paraphrase something he's taught me that I remember, and this also applies to work, any ending, is in order to have a good hello, you must have had a good goodbye, meaning you have to close the door.
Yeah.
And in order to close the door, you need to work through it. So the depression piece, the coming to terms piece, the sadness is something that you have to work through. Next stage is acceptance, which is good riddance, asshole. I'm moving on. It is what it is. But the next stage that I add in beyond the regular stages of grief are, I'm sorry, who?
Yeah.
It's when you don't care anymore. Like
Yeah.
you are so beyond it that it doesn't jack you up anymore. And so I think that, and by the way, with any stage model, it's not sequential. It's not like you work through denial to anger to depression, and then you never go back. Sometimes people circle back. Sometimes people get stuck in one for longer. But the whole goal is to get to the point where you've learned something and you've just literally moved on.
Yeah. And I'm correct in that it is quite possible. Like you said, people can get stuck. They can spiral in one. They're not sequential. It is possible that you wouldn't experience one of these stages, right?
Yeah, it could be. And that doesn't mean that you've necessarily wrongly skipped one. Although, again, people do tend to like to move beyond the depression stage too quickly. And what that would look like is if somebody were in a relationship and said, I'm immediately going to start dating because I don't want to feel bad,
Okay.
or immediately jumped into a new job or something without adequately reflecting on what happened.
Sure. And since we're talking about depression, I think that it bears pointing out what you talked about in the book, that this is not clinical depression. This is the normal and the expected feelings that come with sadness, and they're completely different.
Correct. Depression is you can't get out of bed, you just don't care anymore, and it's a pathological state versus the normal sadness that would come with any ending.
Yeah, yeah, and so, and again, you see this when you think about, like you said, people that are breaking up with even alcohol or drugs. You still grieve that, because I mean you're missing what you're giving up or breaking up with.
Absolutely. Like for example, I would argue that if you have a dependent relationship with alcohol, it's not, while it's not healthy, it still is filling some kind of gap in your life. And so it it can be, and people have used that. To be clear, people have used the term, it's like I've lost a good friend.
Okay.
Now, judge that as you want, but that is a reality that some people feel that way. And there's a book, I think it's called Blackout. I'm not entirely remembering correctly. A fabulous, fabulous book that demonstrates just what I said, like feeling like you're breaking up with a friend.
Okay. Now let's jump to chapter 7. I like the handling extremely bad actors, and I will say what many think, but often are not in positions to say, which is many bosses fit some of these categories you talk about. Now, we're talking the narcissists, we're talking the sociopaths, even abusers in terms of verbal, mental, emotional abuse. I'll go a step further to say that many board members are like this. Again, trust me, I know from firsthand experience. So please tell us, how do we recover from these people? Some who can still hold incredible power over our future career steps.
Yeah, so I'm going to attempt to answer that. Indeed. So my husband used to say this to me often. He said, God must have loved assholes because he put so many of them in the world.
Love
And
that.
so the point of that being that there are flawed people in the world, and there is no way that you're going to get away with not interacting with them. I think that for the average person, it really starts with acknowledging it is what it is and stop taking it personally. Because when you interact with somebody who is flawed at that level, you're going to feel gaslit. You're going to feel like something is, are you losing it? Are you going crazy? Because that's part of the pathological interaction. And so, again, there's not going to be any quick fix. I guess I would say that recognizing they're everywhere.
Yeah.
And B, that it's not something that you can fix. It's great to have somebody that you can talk it out with, because if you're feeling completely sick about things that are being experienced at work, it means there's something bigger going on, and talking it out can help you sort through the process. I think sometimes we get so caught up in the emotion that we don't see some of the things that are right in front of us. Feelings are not rational. And let me go back to something I'm sure that I said in the previous podcast, is that people who work in education are helpers by nature.
Yes.
Like they want to do good in the world. They want to feel valuable. They want to give. They're givers. And so when you have to keep, I'm also big on saying that givers attract takers. So when you have people who are giving by nature, you have to keep in mind that they may be more attractive to people who can't want to manipulate or who want to gaslight or whatever, because those are the people who are going to be like, oh, well, maybe I did do something wrong. They're going to more likely to
Sure.
not question that feedback initially. And so just recognizing that's a reality, recognizing that your feelings aren't rational, talking it out can be helpful. And it all comes back to setting those boundaries. And the other word I have for that is recognizing you have to take that shit over there to
Yeah.
being somebody else. Like you are going to act like that, but you have to act like that over there, not with me. And the last thing, I think, to your question is, how do we survive? And I guess I would say to you, and this is very difficult. I realize that this might come off as judgmental, and I don't mean for it to. People have to be intentional about, do I want to stay in an environment that makes me completely sick? Is it worth it? And what's the strategy here? And being intentional, because every single time you go into that environment, it's going to eat away at you. So you need to have at least a whole host of things that you're going to do to protect yourself if you're going to breathe in that toxic air.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to look out for yourself ultimately, because it can impact your mental health, your physical health. I mean, your all around well being. Now, you mentioned boundaries. We're gonna get to that in just a second, but a couple times just now you mentioned gaslighting. And so I don't know the history as far as when gaslighting became a term that we use to describe the behavior, but I know that I hear it a lot. And so can you just tell us real quick what gaslighting could look like, and are there strategies when we recognize somebody's gaslighting us? Are there strategies we can take?
Yeah. And so gaslighting it came from a movie, and I'm not remembering off the top of my head. I do have it in Getting to Good Riddance. That term came from a movie, but it's essentially when somebody tries to make somebody else feel crazy as a way of trying to control them.
Okay.
So, for example, you're always so sensitive. Everybody thinks that about you. That situation didn't happen the way you're playing it out to happen, and then you start to think, "Wow, am I losing it?" And so you have to keep in mind that somebody does that as a way to control you. I think and what's hard is that, again, most people want to be better, and so we want to be open to feedback. And it's not that you should just completely blow somebody off. But again, if that's a pattern and somebody you always feel crazy about a certain person or with a certain person, that's a red flag, because again, they're trying to control you.
Yeah. And I mean, ultimately, we should know ourselves better than anybody. And so when we begin having kind of those second thoughts on ourselves, then maybe we ought to take a step back and see, maybe what they're saying is not true about me. It's what they're trying to get me to believe. That's how I see it. Am I on the right page?
That's exactly right.
Perfect. All right. So again, shifting to boundaries, you've already kind of given us a hint that this is an important part. And it really caused me to think, though, because boundaries force us to take a deeper look at us. And I gotta say, that was kind of whenever, I mean, you even said this is going to be a heavy chapter because you're forcing that perspective to look inward. And because I always think, oh, boundaries aren't for me. Boundaries are for the people that I say these are the boundaries. But you tell us that experiences with boundaries growing up can play a role in how effective we are at setting them when we're older. So what can you tell us more about boundaries, and how can we all practice at becoming better at setting them and also maintaining them?
So I have yet to meet anybody who didn't struggle with boundaries, because emotions take over as human beings, and we lose sight of what the boundary is.
Yes.
And as I talk about Eric Erickson's stages of development, when kids learn to say no, and it drives adults crazy, but they're learning to set boundaries. No, I want to do it myself. and they learn independence. And to teenagers, no, you can't come into my room. And I'm not saying that parents should just give in to all of that, but it's again learning to set a line of what I'm responsible for and what somebody else is responsible for. And again, helpers, givers have a hard time with that because they don't know when to stop helping. And going back to the bad actor, that is the problem. If somebody is a bad actor and they're typically, those people are externalizing, they're blaming other people for their problems. Oh, the situation didn't go well because of you, and you didn't do this. And so helpers have a hard time understanding that they don't have to take all that on just because somebody dumped it on them.
Right.
That's a boundary. Or feeling like, again, you're working with a bad actor and you're triggered. A boundary is saying to yourself, I can't help that person. I can't fix this. And so the boundary is with yourself. I need to stop. Or a boundary, I need to not go there in my head. The what ifing, or again, feeling completely sorry for somebody. I have to stop. So boundaries are with other people. Boundaries are with self. And by the way, as I was mentioning earlier, making sure that you got a lot of things to take care of yourself in toxic situations. Boundaries are about you have to limit some of the negativity that you're around because it just sucks the life out of you. So
Yes.
boundaries are about saying no sometimes and saying, I'm not going to feel bad about that because I only have so much energy to give.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing, I believe it did come out of this chapter, and you had kind of insinuated like teenagers setting the boundary of, stay out of my room and everything. That as parents and we could even say as teenage or as educators to a certain extent, that I guess violating, I hate to use the word violating, but violating boundaries to protect our children, that's okay. And that there's a lot of stuff as far as like social media out there that we should be involved with that, right? I mean, that was kind of a clarification that I want to make sure to get clear. Like there's clear boundaries we don't cross, but then there's others that we have to as adults to keep others safe.
Yes. And so when I was talking about the Erickson stages, the one in particular with teenagers, for example, it's not okay to walk in my room when I'm undressed, or for somebody else to walk into my room when I'm undressing. But, you have to keep in mind that people, for example, who've had abusive circumstances growing up, they may not recognize boundary crossings like that are abusive because they had those formative experiences. So a teenager, for example, who says, don't touch that part of my body, that is very different. I am really, really emphatic that parents need to be up in their kids' stuff about social media and who they're spending their time with and where they are as being completely different than inappropriate boundary violations.
Yeah. And whenever I read that, it resonated with me because I think it's important that above all else, our job is to keep our children safe or our students safe. So, hey, Jodie, before we go, let's talk about Turning the Page, which is the title of chapter 11. I love this chapter as you talk about happiness. So just as important, you talk about what happiness is not. Let's conclude today's conversation by what to do when we're ready to admit it is time for us to move on and how we can seek out a better tomorrow.
So this goes back to the quote, in order to have a good hello, you must have had a good goodbye. The bad news about what I'm going to say is happiness takes work. In the United States, we think we're entitled to it. If we do all the right things, we should be happy. But it takes a lot of work, just like all relationships. And that's a relationship with self, finding happiness. I think that reflecting on, for example, ending a relationship with work or other people, what went wrong, understanding it, but what did I learn about myself and what do I want? And moving forward, I think it's important to have a really clear idea about the things that bring you joy, about the things that give you those peak experiences and flow experiences, but the things that maybe don't, or if they're intolerable, or things that you must have. And I'm such an advocate of having a roadmap where, and you can take detours, but please have a roadmap. I have to tell you that I do executive coaching, and I'm remembering this executive I was coaching, and I said to him, "What makes you happy?" And he looked like I slapped him across the face. And that is one question that in some respects, it might sound sadistic of me. I don't mean for it to, but if I really want to catch somebody off guard, I say, "What makes you happy?" And you'd be surprised at the number of people who are just sort of dumbstruck about that question. It's again, we get so busy with life and we feel like we have to and we shoulds, and we get caught up in all the obligations. We don't really spend as much time planning and being intentional and saying, "I own my happiness and I got to put some thought and effort into making that happen."
Yeah. And I'm thinking of, just trying to imagine what makes me happy. A lot of times, I think we answer what we feel other people are looking for the answer to be, and we never truly take that inward look.
Well, for sure. And again, if you're a pleaser, all of what we've talked about today goes back to that cognitive behavioral psychology of knowing yourself. If you're a pleaser, you are likely to give the response that is going to sound pleasing to other people. Or if you're worried about being judged, maybe you're going to filter. But in the end, life is short.
It is.
Do what makes you happy. Figure that out. And if you don't know, figure that out.
Yes.
Life is going to pass by so fast. And there will never be enough time. So do what makes you happy.
100%. I could not agree more. And I know if listeners have not already listened to our previous episode 79, go back towards the end of that. Well, listen to the whole thing, but towards the end, we talk about that roadmap to happiness and get more details on that. Jodie, thank you so much for joining us again on Anchored in Education today. And I do believe you'll be back next month talking about teacher resilience.
I am excited to talk about teacher resilience. That's a very fertile area right now.
It really is. And it's going to be an exciting conversation that's going to come right after that end of that first semester as we are dealing with the winter blues and everything else. So it'll be timely in so many ways. So we will see you next month.
Thank you.
Now you can find Jodie on Twitter. Search at @Eckleberry-Hunt. You can also find her on her website at jodieeckleberry-hunt.com. Before I wrap up today's episode, I want to remind you to head over to my website, escottengland.com, and click on the Read More link to read more about Jodie. And don't forget, if you haven't already, to subscribe to Anchored in Education on whatever platform you get your podcasts. Maybe you find today's episode a bit dark. I'm with you in that I wish that every work and life experience we had was gumdrops and lollipops. But we don't live in a utopian world. And while we don't quite live in a dystopian world, we do very much live in a real world. A real world that unfortunately sees perfectly good situations go bad because someone has a mindset shift. And even if that shift is because they are fed lies and other hurtful untruths, it still creates a situation in which you need to break up. I've been through it. I was in a job I loved, in a position where I could shape lives working with people who shared a similar mindset. But I was also in a place that was teeming with insignificant people who could only advance their own agenda if those who stood before them were gone. Recognizing what I needed to do, I left. It was an amazing decision that positively impacted my life. But trust me, that didn't happen immediately. Getting to Good Riddance is an amazing read, and it can easily be reframed to help a person get over a job, an addiction, or anything else they may need to break up with. If you take the steps of getting rid of someone or something that doesn't deserve you, always remember that there are resources and tools at your fingertips. We need the very best of each other, because at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education.